So a fourth and final way that we can bring an image plane into ZBrush to help us with our modeling, and it's sort of the least reliable way, but a lot of people still do it, still like it, and again, this is all personal preference, so whatever works for you. But using it the way I'm about to show you requires a little bit of setup as well. So here's the image we're going to use. All right, so what we're going to do here is just put this behind ZBrush. All right, and I'm going to come in here to my tool palette. We'll click on the big swatch here and bring out a plane 3D. And we'll click and drag, go ahead and hit edit, change the material on that. Actually, might use the Skin Shade 4 on this one. Make it a Polymesh 3D. All right. And there we go. So we're good to go. Now, this guy right here, it's relatively low density. And if I were to try and apply an image to this, let's go up to texture. All right. And here's my image. I'm going to bring that in here. All right. And if I come down here to texture map right here and go ahead and click on this, bring this guy in. You can see we get this right here. It looks upside down. That's fine. I'm going to go ahead and just rotate it. And if I hold shift as I rotate it, you'll see down here a number. So I can rotate this minus 180 degrees, just like that. And we'll come over here. Now, the one problem with this, when we apply a texture to our piece of geometry like this, is it's not proportional. Okay, it does not match the proportions on this. This is much shorter and much fatter. So if you were to model from this, you would be way off model. Remember that proportions are very, very important. They're crucial. If your proportions are off, your model is wrong, no matter how nicely it may be sculpted. All right. So what we need to do is fix the proportions on this image right here. So I'm going to go ahead and set this guy right about here. All right. And we'll go back into ZBrush here. And there's a little button right up here called See-Through, right at the very top. Uh, and it's a bit of a gimmicky thing, but it can help us with this next step here. So I'm going to go ahead and, oops, come on now, work with me. I'm going to grab this see-through and start sliding this over, and you'll see what happens is I can start seeing through ZBrush, and I can see the reference image below. All right. Now, forget my desktop. I've got a desktop image here. Just kind of forget that. But look at the reference image here. All right. So I'm adjusting the opacity on ZBrush so I can see the image below. And what I'm going to do now is come over to my scale button right here. Okay. And I'm going to scale up my image. I'm actually scaling up the plane right here. And I'm going to scale it this way as well. Okay. And I'm going to move this plane around so that I can go ahead and match the image below. So it's going to be a bit of moving and scaling. I'm going to scale this up and move this over. Okay, maybe scale this bit down a little bit more. All right. And you know, your image will become fairly clear once they line up nicely. So a little of this, maybe a little more of this. There we go. All right. And I want to line that up as best I can, those two images. We're getting pretty close right here. There we go. There we go. All right. So now we've matched our image plane, the plane that we brought in. And I can go ahead now and take that transparency all the way down to 0. All right. And we'll go back to draw. Now, the only problem with this is our plane is now a little bit off-center. Because we moved it, and it's really important that we keep our plane centered, it's a little bit off-center. So one thing I would do now is come down here to the deformation palette, and I would hit Unify. Now, when I hit this Unify button, I want you to notice that this will shift a little. All right? Hit Unify. There you go. It shifts. Okay? So let me turn on my floor here. And you can see that this image now is absolutely centered. All right, it's centered between those lines right there. There's a center line. So this reference image is in the center of world space. All right, so we can turn this off and come back in here. So what we want to do now is let's close up deformation and texture paint right here. So from the texture map palette, if we come over here, we're going to do new from, or actually from polypaint here. We're going to do polypaint from texture. Okay, polypaint from texture, and I want you to watch what happens. All right. So MRGB draw mode is off. We need to turn that on. So that's right here, MRGB. We'll turn that on. And again, right here under polypaint. So let's close up texture map. From polypaint from texture, and you'll see what happens. It gets very blurry. So I'm going to undo that. And that's because our plane only has 1,000 polygons. So let me undo that. All right. I'm going to come over here to geometry. And I'm going to turn the smooth modifier off. And I'm going to divide this maybe 6 times. There we go. We're up to 1,000,000 polygons. I can now go ahead and delete the lower levels on that. So now when I come over here to polypaint from texture in the polypaint tab, there we go. And I can close that up. And if I come over to texture now, I can come over and turn that texture off. That paint now is on that plane. All right, that paint has now been applied to that plane. And I can come over here now and save my scene as, save it whatever. All right, it'll save it with that plane right there, and you can see, there's our plane. If I turn the brush off, you can see it turns the paint off. All right, and if we're ready to start modeling, we can come in here and append a sphere. All right, we'll select that sphere and we will scale it down. Okay. And we can go ahead now and start sculpting on this piece of geometry here, making sure that your symmetry is turned on. Now, of course, with this piece of geometry, it does have a pole on it. All right, so we can actually come over here. Let's go ahead and move this out so it's not intersecting the image. And we're going to want to go ahead and turn that into a Dynamesh. Now, if you bring in a sphere like this when you already have a piece of geometry, you do not have to make it a polymesh. It is already a polymesh, all right, that we can sculpt on. But it is a little bit dense and it does have those poles. So again, in our Dynamesh settings, if we come down to geometry, I'm going to take that resolution down to maybe 24, something like that, and go ahead and hit Dynamesh. And there we go. So now we have a nice low-res sphere that we can start to use. Our symmetry lines up in the center as it should. Okay, and with our move brush, we can come in here and start to push and pull and sculpt on this. Okay, just like before, though, if we want to set up a camera so that we can snap back to this. Which really shouldn't, don't even need to set up a camera. If I hold shift, it'll snap back. All right, that sphere is always going to be lined up with that plane. All right, so again, if you come up here and just save it, this is what you'll have right here. Of course, it's a good idea to come in and rename your stuff. So let's turn that off. I'm going to select that. We'll rename this image plane. All right, and there you go. So let's go ahead then and go ahead and save it. It'll save those things together, and you can come back here and sculpt and model on this anytime you want. So this is I don't want to say it's a least reliable way, but it's really important that you match up the size of the image that you bring in here with your actual image. Okay, it's important that you maintain those proportions. All right, so that I just showed you now 4 different ways that you can use image planes. Make sure that you are using them for your model. At the very least, you should have, if you have 2 monitors, if you're lucky enough to have 2 monitors, you should always have your reference image open and at least one of those monitors. Do not be modeling or sculpting without always looking at your reference image. It's very, very important. All right. If you have any questions on this, please contact me. All right. Thank you.